I just I didn't get down to NATO, but there wasn't much of a point this week because entire city blocks were sealed off all around DC. It was reminiscent actually of the post January 6th period where the National Guard was called in and entire sections of DC were sealed off with like blast walls. But you would just go downtown and just see huge accumulations of police, motorcades rolling around with, different delegations from the NATO states. And then the area around the convention center was completely sealed off to the public. No one could get anywhere. Metro stops were being arbitrarily closed. It was kind of a microcosm of what NATO has done to the world and is doing to the world. And it was a momentous summit for a lot of reasons, which we'll discuss in this stream. One, obviously, the Beltway chattering class all wanted to see how Biden would perform. Most of Biden's remarks there, seated with Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, were scripted. He was handed sheets and basically told what to say. But then he had what Trump called his big boy press conference on the final day of the NATO summit, where Biden had to face the press kind of just alone without teleprompters. And, we'll talk about that. But I think what the Beltway press wasn't interested in was how NATO was laying the groundwork for a new Cold War and possibly a nuclear war. They, in their final declaration, accused China of enabling Russia and providing Russia with dual use goods, which can be used for civilian and military purposes, therefore allowing Russia to continue its war effort against Ukraine. So much of the declaration was directed against China, and NATO is seeking to bring Japan into its alliance, a country not very close to the North Atlantic, violating Japan's pacifist post-war constitution and transforming the society and the country further into a frontline base in the new Cold War with China. NATO also announced at this summit a liaison office, not anywhere near the North Atlantic, but in Amman, Jordan. And what's that about? Well, it's clearly about protecting Israel's strategic depth and countering Iran and the popular mobilization units, which actually stand up for Palestine, as we saw when Jordan was the base for U.S. Patriot missile batteries to parry Iran's ballistic missile launches. So NATO is shaping up to be not just an expansionist entity moving towards Russia's frontiers, but a global war alliance directed against any country that doesn't kowtow to the Washington consensus. And this is Biden's true legacy, which I think he actually spoke about, I wouldn't say articulately, but with full command of the facts during his big boy press conference, which we'll address later. Aaron, I don't know if you have any thoughts overall about the NATO summit or just NATO's role in the world today.
Well, a hugely dangerous announcement was unveiled at the NATO gathering, which we'll discuss later, but it's just worth highlighting up top because no one's covered it. It's just got a collective yawn in the West, which is that the Biden administration and Germany jointly announced that the U.S. is going to deploy long-range missiles to Germany now. And these were missiles that were previously explicitly banned under the INF Treaty, which was a major Cold War arms control agreement reached in the 1980s after a global movement of people rose up against nuclear proliferation, which had eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons by the thousands. And Donald Trump, under the leadership of Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, withdrew from the INF Treaty in 2019. And that got a collective yawn inside the U.S. because at that time, that was the peak of Russiagate hysteria, where everybody was conditioned to believe that Trump was really doing Vladimir Putin's bidding and was working to serve Putin's interests because he was being blackmailed with sex tapes and other compromise. So everybody ignored that. And even when Russia proposed moratoriums on the development of those long-term missiles. The U.S. ignored it, and so finally, now we have now the U.S. and Germany saying we're going to deploy missiles in Germany that were previously banned under this treaty, and it's got obviously no criticism at all from supposedly anti-war progressives in Congress because they're on board with this whole agenda. It's insanity, but things are so crazy right now that this kind of reckless behavior is so normalized it doesn't even get a mention. I mean, try to look at progressive media, see who's covered it or even mentioned it. It's been ignored. So we'll talk more about that later, but I think that's worth stressing up at the top of the show.
Well, yeah, and we did kind of just talk about it. Zelensky was in town to on that very point. Zelensky was in DC in one of his pajama costumes, in one of his G.I. Joe Halloween costumes. He might have borrowed it from Tony Blinken's son, who dressed as Zelensky for last Halloween. It's sort of like, is art imitating life or vice versa? Zelensky was there to actually push Biden for missiles that could strike deeper into Russia, or for authorization to use U.S. ATACMS for strikes deeper into Russia. And it's unclear. I thought the U.S. had already authorized that. This is something Biden addressed in his press conferences. And his wife, Olena Zelenska, who's famous for her shopping trips, your U.S. tax dollars at work, was putting on the best face possible for this lobbying campaign. This is the New York Times. As Olena Zelenska, the first lady of Ukraine, accompanies her husband to Washington for the NATO summit, her stylist discusses the role clothes play in the war effort. And here she is seated across from Turkish leader Recep Erdogan, dressed as a extra in The Handmaid's Tale. This is unusual. I don't know what role the clothes are playing there, but it really plays to it really highlights, I think, unwittingly, how disgusting Project Ukraine is, because you have this whole oligarch class that is insulated from the effects of the war, who have been able to evade the draft, while the rest are being used as basically Slavic manpower for the NATO project of weakening Russia at its soft underbelly. Actually, George Soros published an essay, I don't have it up in front of me, oversight on my part, going into NATO, called the NATO and the New World Order, in which he said that Western publics are averse to losing their own soldiers, and also to even participating in the military. Like, there's a recruitment crisis in the US. So the US and Europe, Western Europe, Brussels, can rely on what he called the manpower of Eastern Europe and provide the tech and the materiel while the Slavic masses die. And of course, Olena Zelenska gets to be hailed at Web Summit and to get us canceled from speaking there, as she did 2 years ago in Portugal, with her clothes playing a major role in the war effort.
Here's that quote, Max, from George Soros. This is from years ago.
Thank you. Great
there
job.
It is. The combination of manpower from Eastern Europe with the technical capabilities of NATO reduced the risk of body bags for NATO countries, which is the main constraint on their willingness to act. So, as you say, George Soros's vision has come true. It's come true.
Yeah.
It's
just completely inadvertently.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was all an accident that Uncle George's vision came true.
And, just this display of the first lady of Ukraine being scrutinized for her fashion style, and recall the previous Vogue magazine photo shoots and really weird photo shoots of with models posing as Ukrainian victims. So compare all that, the celebration of wealth and of just of oligarchy that she represents, with the plight of average Ukrainians. So obviously there's hundreds of thousands who've been killed, and all from the lower classes being sacrificed for this war. But then also you have, and we've covered this recently, Ukraine is selling off its state assets to help fund its war effort because they have no money, and the U.S. and its allies, despite all their lofty pledges, aren't providing enough. So Ukraine, as has long been the vision of people like George Soros and other Western oligarchs, has now been forced to sell off its state assets to fund the war effort, in which they're being used as sacrificial lambs for the goal of bleeding Russia.